Well, being that it's starting to get a little hot even in Huntington Beach, this is the bad time of year to wear your priest clothes. But I have a funeral after church today, so I had to look professional. And if nothing else, remember the words of St. Paul to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians. This is really the calling that Paul has to the church through the gospel, which is open wide your hearts. This is the call to Christians in every place, open wide your hearts. And it seems like a fairly simple, not even a command, an invitation, but it's difficult. Paul has to say this to the Corinthians because they're not even sure that the gospel he's bringing is one that they want, if you read 2 Corinthians. And this is going to highlight for us the difficulty of getting to the place of open-heartedness, because there are lots of obstacles along the way. This week has been a week of sitting with people who are suffering. There's been a lot of suffering this week. This is the family for the funeral this afternoon, a family going through a difficult time where the turmoil in the family is bringing up a lot of old patterns of trauma. There was another funeral, and actually there was a wedding, and I don't know, sometimes weddings have their own kind of suffering. So I went to Temecula this week for a wedding, and they did a beautiful wedding, but someone I had married 12 years before, their wedding's not going very well. And so then, they see me as kind of a reminder and or maybe a judge. And I don't want to say, well, I don't care what happens to your wedding, because I do. But it's like, but I also understand that things are problematic and don't go well. But it's sometimes like sometimes when people see me, it's like seeing an ex-girlfriend. And they run into you and they go, oh, he's here. Oh, and you go, well, we had a good relationship. Well, we did, but we don't now. Which is fine. That's just the nature of things. But one of the people I was talking to yesterday on the phone, they were picking out Bible readings to bury a loved one. And they said, tell me the story of Job. They said, I went to Christian school when I was a child. Tell me the story of Job. Because that was one of the potential readings they were thinking about, the very famous, I know that my Redeemer lives. And I said, well, Job is the story of someone whose life was great. And then his life wasn't great. And he was trying to figure out why. And that's why Job is such a classic and wonderful story from the Bible, because so many people have that experience. Everything was going fine. Everything was going great. And now it's not. Why not? And then Job has his friends, and Job's friends spend a lot of time explaining, well, you probably did something that made God mad. Don't you believe in a simple karmic justice? If you do good things, you'll get good things. If you do bad things, you'll get bad things. And Job goes, I'm telling you, I didn't do anything. And they go, okay, Job, okay, sure. Because part of the problem is Job's friends realize that if Job is right, their lives are in danger too. But if they can find a reason why Job is wrong, then they can protect themselves from a similar kind of suffering. And this is a very human behavior, that when we see people who are suffering, we go, well, I don't want that happening to me. Is there something I can do to exempt myself from that? And if it's their fault, then we go, well, of course it's your fault, so, God had to do that to you. And Job goes, no, it's not. And if you've been seeing our daily devotionals online, the last 2 days have been Job preparing himself for his defense before God, because that's what he wants. He goes, I want a hearing before God, and I want to tell God, and I want God to justify me and say, you're right. And I want to know why this happened to me. I want God to tell me. I don't care about you, my friends. I want God to tell me. Well, Job gets that appointment, and that's what Jean read today, which is essentially God coming in a major storm, the phenomenon of a storm. This is why the early religious science of the world, many of the experiences of the divine were experienced in natural phenomena like storms and lack of storms and crazy oceans. Because that was human beings experiencing the power of nature, really. And this is one of the great revolutions of the Old Testament, is that when God is introduced, God is the creator of natural phenomenon and not just the experience of storms and seas and that kind of thing. But anyhow, God speaks out of the whirlwind and basically says to Job, sorry, you're not going to get the answer you want. You're not going to get the answer you want. By the way, were you there when I built all this stuff? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the stars sang at the creation of the morning? And Job realizes he's way out of his league. But that doesn't mean he's not unhappy still. And it doesn't mean he's not unsatisfied. And this is where we find one of those obstacles to open-heartedness, which is people say my life was going great, now it's not, and now I don't even get any answers why not. And when God says, well, I'm God and you're not, okay, that's an answer, but it's not a satisfying answer to me. So what do I do with that? And basically what happens is Job does get redeemed, Job does get restored, but he never gets the answer he wanted, and he never gets the information he wanted. Now, this is something that we were taught long ago. Knowledge binds anxiety. When we're very anxious about life, we want to know. This is why when you get a medical test, and they say, well, you'll have the results in 2 weeks. You spend 2 weeks agonizing, going, well, what does it mean? Like one of our friends just announced this week that she has cancer, but at first she just thought, oh, I just have a growth on my hip. And then, you go and get tested, and they go, oh, that's not what it is. Well, what is it? Well, we don't know yet. Oh, great. Well, what could it be? Well, it could just be this, but it could be this. So it's either we can manage this, or, well, this could be the end of your life. And you're going, well, what am I supposed to do with that information? Well, just wait for the test results. And then you spend weeks agonizing over, and people just go, I would rather have the surgery. I would rather start the treatment. I'd rather start planning my funeral than sit in this time of agony of not knowing. And that's where so many people get left, in the dissatisfaction of not knowing. And so Paul's call to the open heart is resisted because we go, well, how can I open my heart in a world where things can change so quickly? So that's one of the problems, the dissatisfaction that comes with innocent suffering or comes without not knowing reasons why, or we go this way and then we go that way, and there's no clear explanation. It feels meaningless or useless. Well, when we get to the gospel text this morning, we have the very famous story of Jesus sleeping in the boat. And I used to have a guy, now this was a guy, he would come to the men's breakfast. One time he came to the men's breakfast, and I go, not at this church, I go, good morning, Bob. And he goes, I forgot my teeth, I'll be right back. So he had to drive home, get his teeth, come back to the breakfast. The food was a little hard, so he couldn't just gum it, and he would always sleep during church. Every Sunday he would sleep. And he was married to this little Norwegian lady with very sharp elbows. And she would always be elbowing him, like, come on, wake up, get up. And so finally, this was the text that day. And he came out of church and he said, see, he said, I'm just doing what Jesus did. And I go, yeah, but we only have one, he only did that once. You do it every single week, And Jesus didn't have anyone elbowing him. He didn't have any Norwegians on the boat elbowing him into the side like that. But now this is where we're going to see, I think, one reason why Job didn't get the answer he wanted, which was the way God is going to deal with the problem, because God is going to deal with this problem of life was good and then it's bad and we don't know why and what are we supposed to do in this world of suffering. But God's going to deal with it in a very different way. God's not going to say, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to give you the information you need. I'm going to download it. Here, click on this link and read this article about innocent suffering and its meaning with God. Rather, what God's going to do is God's going to come amongst us in Jesus. And this is where the incarnation of Jesus, the taking on of human flesh, the taking on of human experience, Jesus himself is going to express the solidarity with suffering. People who are wondering, my life was good and now it's not, or why hasn't this happened for me, or what does this mean that my own body is eating away at itself? Jesus is going to take on this experience of innocent suffering all the way to the cross. But here we are in this boat, and the disciples are flipping out because they know the world of nature is very cruel. The world of nature doesn't care who you are. So if you take a boat out onto the ocean and you go, I know, but I'm a really good person, don't flood my boat during this storm. That's not what happens. The waves don't do that. There are all sorts of instances. I mean, you can think of something like the Titanic, or you can think of something like the submersible, or you can think of anything where people messed around with the world of nature and water always win. So when Jesus is sleeping, these are professional fishermen. They go, this isn't the time to sleep. And then Jesus is like, what's the problem? The problem is our boat is sinking. Now, this is the same protest that Job is offering, going, don't you care? Don't you care what we're going through right now? We are being confronted with an unexpected storm, and what are we supposed to do? And they forget that having Jesus with them does make a difference. And this is something that you can think about too with Paul's call to being open-hearted, which is having Jesus with you makes a difference, but it may not be the difference that you want. Meaning, Jesus is just not a concierge. going, Jesus, can you please change the weather? Hold on, yep, let me change the weather right now. Jesus is still going to put us into situations that require vulnerability and, from our perspective, a kind of insurmountable danger. But he is with us now, the Lord of the wind and the waves. And Jesus was going to sleep through the whole thing. It would be interesting to know what would have happened if they hadn't woken up, or if they hadn't woken him up. What would happen that Jesus was with them and unafraid? And if there's one additional meaning of Christ taking on solidarity with us, meaning taking on our flesh, it is that Jesus will begin to tutor us in the way of living fearlessly, unafraid. Now, of course, we're humans. We have this sort of primitive instinct in us, which is like, well, part of having natural fear is avoiding being eaten by an animal somewhere in that bush, so you need to be afraid. I'm not saying that we're going to live without any experience of fear, but Jesus is going to teach us how to manage our fear, or how to direct it as a kind of prayer. This is very important because a lot of people are living fearful lives. A lot of people are living anxious lives, and it's not without reason. Job had a reason why he was afraid and angry. Peter and the people in the boat have a reason why they're afraid and upset. So it's not that there aren't reasons to do that. It just means that Jesus is going to change our relationship with that reality. The reality is the reality that it is. There's a storm, the boat is sinking. But our relationship to that reality means something different now. Now, Jesus could have said, well, what happens if maybe you'll die? And they go, yeah, that's what we're trying to avoid. We'd prefer not to. We'd prefer not to sink in the boat. And he goes, I'm not worried about that either, because I'm the God of death as well as life. See, that sort of primitive human experience of religion, which was God is the whirlwind, God is the hurricane, God is the earthquake, now we find out that it's less about God and the natural elements than it is that God is the author of life and the master over our death and our dying, and that has a new meaning. Jesus is going to change our relationship to our biological existence and give it a new spiritual value. This is why Paul tells us to live open-hearted, and this is why the Corinthians aren't so sure they want to hear the message of Paul's gospel, because Paul's gospel is all about Christ crucified. And when you start talking about Christ crucified, when you talk about Jesus not avoiding the question of innocent suffering, but actually confronting it and taking it on himself so that there's a pathway of redemption, when you hear Christian language about being crucified with Christ, like when we do the commendations at funerals going, if we have shared a death like Christ, we will share a life with Christ. All of this language of crucified love, it is a very different gospel than people who would prefer to have a kind of workaround, a kind of pushing it away, or a kind of narcotic effect. Well, if it's going to happen, I don't want to feel it. I just want to be kind of blissed out. This is the difficulty of discipleship. It is the difficulty of following Jesus closely, understanding that we can live with an open heart, even in dangerous circumstances, because the one who is with us is powerful enough to redeem, not just to stop the wind, not just to stop the rain, but to bring the dead to life. This will be the message that will be spoken this afternoon in a very difficult circumstance, which is a message of hope, a message of redemption, a message of soothing of suffering and pain, a message of peace in the midst of a sea of sadness and regret. It will be the message of the good news. It will be the human longing reaching out to God, going, God, what are you going to do about this? It's the cry of Job, and it may be the cry that you've offered too. God, what are you going to do about this? And what God's going to do is come amongst us at Christmas, take on our flesh with Jesus, be with us in these moments of difficulty, and finally go to a place we cannot be, which is the cross and even the experience of hell, so that any place we go, Christ can be there to meet us. And by that solidarity and by that friendship, we don't have to be afraid. We can live with an open heart, and we can be messengers of this word of redemption. Amen.